72,000 men fill a football stadium in Boulder, Colorado. They're singing worship songs with their arms raised, some crying, many kneeling. It's 1993, and this isn't a football game or a concert. It's a Promise Keepers rally, and scenes like this are happening in stadiums across America. The next year, over 278,000 men will attend these events. By 1996, that number will exceed 1 million. Christian men from every denomination and background gathering in massive numbers to worship, weep, and commit to being better husbands, fathers, and followers of Jesus. It's the largest men's movement in American history, generating hundreds of millions of dollars, commanding political influence, and reshaping how evangelicals think about masculinity and faith. Then, almost overnight, it collapses. The stadium's empty. The organization hemorrhages staff. By the early 2000s, Promise Keepers is a shell of what it was, and by 2020, it's barely functioning. What happened? How did a movement that mobilized millions of men, that seemed to tap into something profound and necessary, fall apart so completely? The answer is more complex and more revealing about American evangelicalism than you might expect. The story begins with Bill McCartney, the head football coach at the University of Colorado. In March 1990, McCartney was driving to a Fellowship of Christian Athletes event with his friend Dave Wardle when they started talking about the state of Christian men in America. McCartney was troubled by what he saw. Men who claimed to be Christians but whose lives showed no real evidence of it. Husbands who were neglecting their families. Fathers who were absent emotionally even when physically present. Church members who showed up on Sundays but lived no differently than non-believers the rest of the week. The conversation sparked something in McCartney. What if there was a movement specifically calling men to take their faith seriously, to keep their promises, to be accountable? The first Promise Keepers event was held in July 1991 at the University of Colorado's basketball arena. McCartney hoped maybe a few hundred men would show up. 4,200 came. They filled the arena, participated enthusiastically, and left wanting more. McCartney knew he'd tapped into something powerful. Men were hungry for this kind of challenge, this kind of community, this kind of purpose. The movement exploded with speed that shocked even its founders. In 1992, Promise Keepers held events in multiple cities, drawing over 22,000 men total. In 1993, that number jumped to 50,000. By 1994, they were filling NFL stadiums. The 1994 Boulder event drew 278,000 men. Think about that number. Nearly 300,000 men traveling to Colorado, paying $50 each to spend a weekend in a stadium singing, praying, and listening to speakers challenge them to be godly men. The formula was powerful in its simplicity. Promise Keepers events were built around 7 promises that men were challenged to keep. Honor Jesus Christ through worship, prayer, and obedience. Pursue vital relationships with a few other men for mutual support and accountability. Practice spiritual, moral, ethical, and sexual purity. Build strong marriages and families through love, protection, and biblical values. Support the mission of the church by honoring pastoral leadership and contributing time and resources. Reach beyond racial and denominational barriers to demonstrate the power of biblical unity. Influence the world by being obedient to the Great Commandment and the Great Commission. These promises were deliberately broad and seemingly uncontroversial within evangelical Christianity. Who could argue against men committing to sexual purity or being better fathers? The genius was in creating a framework that men from different denominational backgrounds could unite around. Baptists, Pentecostals, Methodists, non-denominational evangelicals, they could all agree on these core commitments. The events themselves were emotionally intense experiences. They typically ran from Friday evening through Saturday, held in massive stadiums that created an atmosphere of scale and importance. Worship bands led thousands of men in singing contemporary Christian songs, often with a rock concert feel. Speakers, usually well-known pastors and Christian leaders, would deliver messages about masculinity, responsibility, family, and faith. These weren't gentle Sunday morning sermons. They were confrontational challenges delivered with passion and urgency. Tony Evans, an influential African-American pastor from Dallas, became one of Promise Keeper's most powerful speakers. He would challenge men about their roles as spiritual leaders in their homes, telling them to take back the leadership that God had intended them to have. James Dobson, founder of Focus on the Family, spoke about the assault on traditional family values and called men to defend biblical manhood against cultural forces trying to redefine it. Jack Hayford, Bill Hybels, Chuck Swindoll, these prominent evangelical voices all contributed to Promise Keepers events. The emotional crescendo of these events typically came during altar call moments when men were invited to come forward to recommit their lives to Christ, to confess failures, to seek reconciliation with God and others. Thousands of men would stream down from stadium seats to the field, many weeping openly. The sight of grown men crying, embracing, confessing, making commitments, this was unlike anything most participants had experienced. The vulnerability, the emotion, the sense of solidarity with thousands of other men on the same journey, it was transformative for many attendees. This is Professor Archive, where we explore the movements that shaped our recent past. If this kind of in-depth storytelling resonates with you, hitting that super thanks button genuinely helps. Quick question, where are you watching this from? Drop your location in the comments. By 1996, Promise Keepers was at its absolute peak. They held events in 22 cities across America, drawing over 1.1 million men total. The organization's annual budget exceeded $117 million. They employed over 450 staff members at their headquarters in Denver. Millions of Promise Keepers books were in print. Small group materials were being used by churches across the country. The organization was partnering with denominations and parachurch groups, creating an interconnected web of influence throughout evangelical Christianity. The demographic was fascinating. These weren't marginal figures in American Christianity. Promise Keepers attracted mainstream evangelical men, predominantly white but with significant efforts toward racial reconciliation that brought notable African American and Latino participation. They were middle class, married with children, active in churches. They were exactly the constituency that represented the heart of American evangelicalism in the 90s. The political dimensions of Promise Keepers were complicated and contested. The leadership repeatedly insisted that Promise Keepers was not a political organization and that events did not promote specific political candidates or parties. However, the values being promoted, biblical masculinity, traditional family structures, male spiritual leadership, naturally aligned with conservative political positions. Christian right organizations saw Promise Keepers as a mobilization tool, a way to activate millions of evangelical men who could then be directed toward political causes. The 1997 Stand in the Gap rally in Washington, D.C. was the apex and, in retrospect, the beginning of the end. Promise Keepers organized what they called a sacred assembly of men on the National Mall to confess sins, seek revival, and commit to spiritual renewal. Estimates vary, but somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million men attended. It was one of the largest gatherings in Washington, D.C. history. Men traveled from all 50 states. The National Mall was completely packed with men standing shoulder to shoulder. The stated purpose was spiritual, not political. The emphasis was on confession, reconciliation across racial lines, and personal commitment to godliness. But holding such a massive gathering of conservative Christian men in the nation's capital 2 blocks from the Capitol building inevitably carried political overtones. Critics, particularly feminist organizations and progressive religious groups, viewed the gathering as a demonstration of patriarchal power and a threat to gender equality and women's rights. The controversy around Promise Keepers had been building for years. Feminist critics argued that the emphasis on male leadership in families was code for female submission and patriarchal control. They pointed to language about men taking back their role as head of household and worried about what that meant for women's autonomy and safety. Organizations like the National Organization for Women actively opposed Promise Keepers, seeing it as part of a broader backlash against feminism and women's advancement. The racial reconciliation emphasis within Promise Keepers was both genuine and fraught with problems. To their credit, Promise Keepers made racial unity one of their 7 promises and featured Black and Latino speakers prominently. They challenged white men to confront racism and build relationships across racial lines. Events often included powerful moments of confession and reconciliation between men of different races. However, critics noted that the reconciliation framework was individualistic and emotional, rather than addressing systemic racism or economic injustice. Men could hug and cry together at a stadium event while returning to segregated churches and communities where nothing fundamentally changed. The theology of masculinity that Promise Keepers promoted was rooted in complementarianism, the belief that men and women have different, complementary roles ordained by God. Men are called to lead, provide, and protect. Women are called to support, nurture, and submit to male leadership. This theological framework, while presented as biblical and benevolent, raised serious concerns among those who saw it as justifying male dominance and restricting women's full participation in church and society. Promise Keepers' leadership defended their vision vigorously. Bill McCartney and the organization's spokespeople insisted they were calling men to servant leadership modeled after Jesus, not domineering control. They argued that the epidemic of fatherlessness and family breakdown in America required a return to biblical family structures. They maintained that respecting male leadership didn't diminish women, but honored the different ways God designed men and women to function. But behind the public success, serious problems were emerging. The financial model was unsustainable. The massive stadium events were extraordinarily expensive to produce. Renting NFL stadiums, booking high-profile speakers, marketing to draw huge crowds, providing materials and resources, all of this required enormous outlays of money. The $50 registration fee from attendees covered only a fraction of costs. The rest came from donations, corporate sponsorships, and church partnerships. In 1998, Promise Keepers made a decision that seemed spiritually motivated but proved financially catastrophic. They announced that all future conferences would be free. The stated reason was to remove financial barriers and allow any man who wanted to attend to do so, regardless of economic circumstances. It was framed as a faith step, trusting God to provide the necessary funds through donations. The practical result was an immediate and devastating loss of revenue. Attendance actually dropped when the events became free. It seems counterintuitive, but charging a registration fee created commitment. Men who paid $50 were invested. They made travel plans, booked hotels, arranged time off work. Free events attracted more casual interest but less follow-through. The quality of attendees, measured by their engagement and likelihood to continue involvement beyond the event, declined. More critically, the donor base that was supposed to replace registration revenue never materialized at the necessary scale. Promise Keepers had been built on event revenue, not on cultivating individual donors or building an endowment. When registration income disappeared, the organization faced immediate financial crisis. By late 1998, Promise Keepers announced it was laying off its entire staff, over 340 people. The organization claimed this was a restructuring, a new season where ministry would be done by volunteers. In reality, it was a financial collapse. What time is it where you are? I'm always curious about when people are engaging with these stories. Let me know in the comments. The layoffs were devastating not just financially, but symbolically. Staff members who had dedicated years to the movement, who had believed they were part of something transformative, were suddenly unemployed. Many had relocated to Denver for these jobs, uprooting families to be part of Promise Keepers. The abrupt terminations, even if framed spiritually, felt like betrayal to many. Promise. Keepers continued in a reduced capacity, holding smaller events and relying heavily on volunteer labor. But the momentum was broken. Attendance at events never recovered. The cultural moment had passed. By the early 2000s, Promise Keepers was operating on a tiny fraction of its peak budget with minimal staff and declining influence. Several factors contributed to the decline beyond the immediate financial crisis. First, the movement struggled with sustainability beyond the emotional peak of stadium events. Men would attend a conference, have a powerful experience, make commitments, and then return to normal life without the structures or support to maintain those commitments. Promise Keepers tried to address this through local accountability groups and ongoing discipleship materials, but these initiatives never gained the traction of the big events. The movement was built on spectacular gatherings, and without them, it lost its identity. Second, the cultural and political landscape was shifting. The late 90s saw the Clinton impeachment, the contested 2000 election, and increasing political polarization. The optimistic, nonpartisan spiritual revival that Promise Keepers represented felt increasingly out of step. Evangelical men were being mobilized politically around specific issues like abortion and same-sex marriage in ways that superseded the broader spiritual focus of Promise Keepers. Third, generational change was underway. Promise Keepers appealed primarily to boomer and older Gen X men. Younger men coming of age in the late 90s and early 2000s had different cultural touchpoints and were increasingly skeptical of mass movements and emotional manipulation. The earnest masculinity that Promise Keepers promoted felt outdated to men shaped by irony, individualism, and postmodern sensibilities. Fourth, the family values framework that Promise Keepers championed was under increasing scrutiny even within evangelicalism. Divorce rates among evangelicals were as high as the general population, revealing that commitment to traditional family values in principle didn't translate to success in practice. The vision of the nuclear family with the husband as provider and spiritual leader was becoming less tenable economically as two-income households became necessary for middle-class stability. Fifth, the lack of denominational or institutional backing left Promise Keepers vulnerable. Unlike movements embedded within denominational structures, Promise Keepers was an independent parachurch organization. When financial problems hit, there was no larger institution to provide support. Churches that had partnered with Promise Keepers moved on to other programs and emphases. The network that had seemed so strong during the boom years proved fragile when tested. The leadership transition challenges were significant. Bill McCartney stepped down as president in 2003, though he remained involved. Subsequent leaders struggled to recapture McCartney's vision and charisma. McCartney was a nationally recognized figure because of his football coaching career. He had credibility and name recognition that his successors lacked. Promise Keepers had been built around his personality and vision, and without him at the helm, it lost direction. The Promise Keepers model was also being replicated and fragmented. Various men's ministries emerged in local churches, offering similar content and community without the need for massive stadium events or national organization. Books about biblical manhood proliferated. Conferences focused on specific aspects of men's spiritual lives, from fatherhood to sexual purity to workplace Christianity, drew targeted audiences. Promise Keepers had pioneered the Christian men's movement, but by the mid-2000s, that market was crowded with competitors offering more specialized and sustainable approaches. The theological critiques of Promise Keepers also intensified over time. Progressive evangelicals and mainline Protestants had always been skeptical of the complementarian theology underlying the movement. But by the 2000s, even within conservative evangelicalism, there were growing questions about whether Promise Keepers' emphasis on male leadership was creating or solving problems. Reports of spiritual abuse, where men use the language of biblical headship to justify controlling or abusive behavior toward wives, raised concerns that Promise Keepers' teaching, however well-intentioned, could be weaponized. The racial reconciliation emphasis that had been a distinctive of Promise Keepers in the 90s largely disappeared as the organization declined. The multiracial gatherings and the calls for white men to confront racism had been powerful moments. But without sustained programming and institutional commitment, those moments didn't lead to lasting change. By the 2000s, American evangelicalism was as racially divided as ever, and Promise Keepers had little to say about it. The Stand in the Gap rally in 1997, which had seemed like a triumph, proved to be an unsustainable peak. You can't maintain movement momentum through occasional massive demonstrations. The logistical challenge of getting hundreds of thousands of men to Washington, D.C. was enormous and couldn't be replicated regularly. After Stand in the Gap, subsequent events felt like diminished reruns rather than fresh expressions of the movement. The economic model of Christian conferences and events was also changing. By the 2000s, churches and individuals had access to high-quality teaching and worship experiences through media that didn't require expensive travel to stadium events. Why spend hundreds of dollars on travel and registration when you could get similar content from a book, a DVD series, or increasingly through online streaming? Promise Keepers had thrived in an era when stadium events were the pinnacle of Christian experience. That era was ending. The Promise Keepers brand became increasingly associated with a specific era and generation. For men who had attended events in the 90s, Promise Keepers held powerful memories and nostalgia. But for younger men, it was their father's movement, not theirs. Attempts to rebrand or modernize struggled because the core identity was so tied to a particular cultural moment that had passed. The Me Too movement and broader cultural reckoning with toxic masculinity in the late 2010s created an even more challenging environment for Promise Keepers' theology of manhood. The emphasis on male leadership and authority that had been central to Promise Keepers looked increasingly problematic in light of revelations about how male power had been abused across industries and institutions, including churches. The conversation about healthy masculinity was moving away from the complementarian framework Promise Keepers had championed. Internal conflicts and leadership turmoil plagued the organization in its declining years. There were disputes over direction, finances, and vision. Different factions within the organization had competing ideas about how to revive or reimagine the movement. These conflicts, while kept mostly private, drained energy and resources and prevented coherent strategic planning. By 2020, Promise Keepers was operating with a skeleton staff out of a small office, a far cry from the 450-person operation headquartered in Denver at the movement's peak. They held occasional small events and maintained a website with resources, but there was no meaningful national presence or influence. The organization that had once mobilized millions had become a footnote in evangelical history. The COVID-19 pandemic dealt another blow. The in-person gatherings that were central to Promise Keepers' identity were impossible during lockdowns. While the organization tried to pivot to online content, they lacked the infrastructure and expertise to compete in the crowded digital space. Other ministries had been building online presence for years. Promise Keepers was trying to catch up from a position of organizational weakness. There was an attempted relaunch in 2021 and 2022, with new leadership trying to revive Promise Keepers for a new generation. They held events that drew thousands, not the hundreds of thousands of the glory days, but respectable numbers suggesting some ongoing interest. The messaging shifted slightly, trying to address contemporary concerns while maintaining core commitments to biblical manhood and family values. Whether this represents a genuine revival or a last gasp remains to be seen, but early indicators suggest that recapturing the scale and influence of the 90s movement is unlikely. The lessons from Promise Keepers' rise and fall are significant for understanding American evangelicalism and religious movements more broadly. First, mass movements built primarily on emotional peak experiences are inherently unsustainable. The stadium events created powerful moments but didn't build the deep, sustained discipleship infrastructure necessary for long-term impact. Second, financial models matter enormously. Promise Keepers' decision to make events free while spiritually motivated was organizationally catastrophic and revealed poor planning and financial management. Third, movements centered on charismatic leaders struggle with succession. Bill McCartney was Promise Keepers, and when his active leadership ended, the movement lost its animating force. Fourth, cultural relevance is temporary. The specific expression of Christian masculinity that resonated in the 90s increasingly felt outdated as cultural conversations about gender evolved. Fifth, theological frameworks that don't engage seriously with critiques and changing realities become brittle. Promise Keepers' complementarianism was presented as timeless biblical truth, but its inability to adapt to questions about gender equality and power dynamics limited its long-term viability. If you're finding value in this investigation, a super thanks genuinely helps keep this channel producing content like this. It makes a real difference. The personal stories of men whose lives were genuinely changed by Promise Keepers are real and shouldn't be dismissed. Thousands of men credit Promise Keepers with saving their marriages, healing relationships with children, overcoming addictions, or finding authentic faith for the first time. These testimonies represent genuine transformation and shouldn't be erased by the movement's organizational failures. However, there are also stories of harm. Women whose husbands returned from Promise Keepers events with renewed insistence on male authority in ways that were controlling or abusive. Churches that split over disagreements about gender roles inflamed by Promise Keepers' teaching. Men who felt shamed by the movement's emphasis on sexual purity and struggled with guilt that was spiritually unhealthy. The complicated legacy includes both help and harm. The racial reconciliation failure of Promise Keepers is particularly poignant. The movement had an opportunity to mobilize millions of white evangelical men to seriously engage with racism and work toward justice. Instead, the reconciliation emphasis was mostly symbolic, focused on emotional moments of connection without systemic analysis or action. 2 decades later, white evangelicalism's failure to address racism seriously remains one of its most glaring problems. The gender theology that Promise Keepers promoted has had lasting influence even as the organization declined. The language of biblical manhood, servant leadership, and male spiritual responsibility that Promise Keepers popularized has been carried forward by countless churches, books, and ministries. The complementarian framework has become more entrenched in many evangelical circles, partly because of the foundation Promise Keepers laid. The political legacy is complex. While Promise Keepers officially remained nonpartisan, the mobilization of evangelical men that it achieved created networks and cultural momentum that were leveraged for political purposes. The connections formed at Promise Keepers events, the sense of solidarity and mission, these translated into political activism around the Christian rights agenda. Whether this was an intended consequence or an unintended outcome depends on who you ask. The collapse of Promise Keepers represents a broader pattern in American evangelicalism of boom and bust movements. The Christian Coalition, the Moral Majority, the seeker-sensitive movement, church growth programs, each had its moment of seeming unstoppable growth and influence before declining or transforming beyond recognition. Promise Keepers fit this pattern perfectly, a movement that captured a cultural moment, mobilized millions, and then faded as the moment passed and structural weaknesses became apparent. The question of whether Promise Keepers could have sustained itself with better financial management and strategic planning is debatable. Perhaps with a more sustainable business model, diversified revenue streams, and careful succession planning, the organization could have remained viable at a smaller scale. But the fundamental challenge was that the movement's power came from its mass appeal and spectacular events. At a smaller scale, Promise Keepers would have been indistinguishable from dozens of other men's ministries. The theological question at the heart of Promise Keepers, what does it mean to be a godly man, remains urgent. The movement's specific answer centered on male headship, traditional family roles, and masculinity defined by leadership and protection has been increasingly questioned. But the vacuum left by Promise Keepers' decline hasn't been filled with a compelling alternative vision from within evangelicalism. Progressive and egalitarian approaches exist, but haven't achieved anything like the mobilization that Promise Keepers managed. The nostalgia for Promise Keepers among men who attended in its heyday is powerful. Many describe those stadium events as among the most spiritually significant experiences of their lives. The sense of being part of something larger, of being surrounded by thousands of men pursuing the same goals, of feeling challenged and inspired, this created memories that remain vivid decades later. For these men, the collapse of Promise Keepers feels like the loss of something irreplaceable. The organizational archives of Promise Keepers, the materials, resources, and documentation of the movement, represent a significant piece of evangelical history. Researchers studying late 20th century American Christianity, masculinity movements, or evangelical culture will find rich material in studying Promise Keepers. The movement's rise and fall illuminate broader cultural trends and tensions that continue to shape American religion and politics. The collapse wasn't a single moment, but a slow unraveling over more than 2 decades. From the peak in 1996 through the financial crisis of 1998, the struggles of the early 2000s, the failed revival attempts in the 2010s, to the minimal operation today, Promise Keeper's decline has been gradual and painful for those who were invested in it. There was no dramatic scandal that brought it down, no single catastrophic failure, just the accumulation of unsustainable practices, changing cultural realities, and the inability to adapt. What happened to the Christian men's movement that Promise Keepers represented? It fractured and dispersed. Elements of it continue in various forms through local church men's ministries, books and conferences on biblical manhood, and ongoing emphasis on men's spiritual leadership in evangelical churches. But the unified mass movement that could fill stadiums in dozens of cities and mobilize over 1 million men in a single year, that's gone. The cultural moment that made it possible has passed. The organizational infrastructure that supported it has collapsed. The vision that animated it has been contested and complicated by changing understandings of gender, power, and what it means to follow Jesus. The Promise Keeper story is ultimately a case study in how movements rise and fall, how cultural moments can be powerful but fleeting, how good intentions and genuine spiritual hunger can coexist with problematic theology and unsustainable practices, and how even the most impressive human organizations are fragile when foundations are flawed. The stadiums that once held hundreds of thousands of men worshiping and weeping together now host football games and concerts. And a generation of men who once promised to keep their commitment struggle to understand what became of the movement that meant so much to them.